Wargaming clubs were growing around the country, and one of the largest was Midwest Military Simulation Association. And that name said it all. Wargaming was serious business. It was part of a legacy tied to the legendary H.G. Wells. It was the descendant of the noble game of king's chess, and it had even altered the course of history in Central Europe. Fantasy ideas that came up were dismissed as childish. But that was about to change, as a new form of wargaming emerged that saw not riflemen and cannons, but orcs and wizards. A new age was dawning, the age of magic users. Perhaps the most significant first step taken from wargaming to RPGs was done by David Wesley, the one who rediscovered strategos and the idea of the all-powerful independent referee in gaming. He had conceived the idea for a new wargame with himself as the referee, known to gamers as Braunstein, set in the fictional German city of Braunstein. Typically in the war games, the two sides had commanders who ran the main army and a number of players who then handled smaller forces on either side. In this case, the two commanders were actually already in the city and their armies outside. Since the armies had nothing to do yet, Wesley had the idea to give them individuals of their own to play, essentially a reversal of what centuries of wargaming had done, to go from groups of units back to a single piece. The result was chaos. The players had been given their own objectives to keep busy with, but they were doing all manner of crazy things that Wesley had never planned for, holding secret meetings and wanting to duel each other. It was an utter mess. No one won the game, and Wesley left in defeat. His game a flop, at least in his mind. What he hadn't realized is that nobody cared about the winning. The game itself was a complete blast to play, and they pleaded for another Braunstein. But Braunstein 2 and 3 were both big disappointments, as Wesley had made changes that reined everyone in, when what they really loved was the freedom that the first Braunstein had given them. Finally, Braunstein 4 offered a return to the original with a new setting. It was a banana republic complete with secret police, student revolutionaries, corrupt treasury ministers, and the great El Jefe. It was set up more like a war game, where you still commanded units, but according to accounts, there is obviously some room for memory to grow fuzzy and truth embellished for a good story. What turned it from a war game into something else was one person who, to use the future concept of alignment, could be considered a chaotic neutral in this setting. David Arneson was assigned to play a minor role, the peaceful revolutionary student leader whose only purpose was to see as many of his leaflets in favor of revolution get out to the people as possible. But Arneson was the kind of player always looking for something new. And what is perhaps the most famous example of this, he was refereeing a game set during the Roman conquest of Britain. The Britons were not doing well, and the Romans charged with an elephant. Seeing how bored the group was becoming with the campaign, Arneson indicated a druid on the British side had just eliminated the charging elephant before it could trample the locals, and not with a period-appropriate weapon, or even some kind of a supernatural weapon that might be appropriate to a druid, but simply whipping out a Star Trek-like phaser and vaporizing it. Arneson was a completely outside-the-box thinker. So instead of doing the minor job he'd been assigned in Braunstein 4, Arneson turned into an element of sheer chaos. He had created a fake CIA badge that would be seen by anyone who would arrest him, and managed to completely disrupt everyone attempting to do the campaign in a straightforward manner. But all of it was in pursuit of his goals, the goals he created for this revolutionary based upon what he had been told and built from it, to really play his role. By the time the climax came, he had successfully bamboozled the rest into assuming that he was a secret CIA operative and that the national treasure being fought over should be put in his hands for safekeeping, after which he was then escorted to a helicopter to allow him to safely make his escape. And there, at the end, having gotten the treasure, he then racked up his score by dumping his briefcase full of flyers out of the helicopter to drop into the hands of the huge crowds that filled the streets. Arneson had just won a war game with a pacifist. After that, Wesley had completed grad school and gone off to the actual army, but gave permission for Braunstein to continue in his absence. Arneson and David Jenkins would take turns as referee, although the new setting was Jenkins' idea, an Old West town called Braunstein, the English translation of Braunstein. Jenkins' scenario included famous Western characters, frequently disguised. Jesse James was a preacher, or parodied. Pancho Villa was El Pancho, with paunch meaning a bit of a gut. It was run like the Braunstein games, but with a new twist: continuity between games. If you played Jesse James' last game, you played him again this game, and had all the consequences of the last game. Arneson's game was next, and it would be legendary. It goes without saying that for events that happened more than a half-century ago, with so much changing because of it, with the bitter feelings that were to come, and with the transparent rewriting of history that took place, that conflicting accounts of what all happened exist. One account is that Arneson brought his group in, announced that fictionalized versions of themselves had been sent through time, and led them into a castle where, in the dungeons, a toy brontosaurus with a fanged head made from clay waited for them, which Arneson said was a dragon. Another tale said that it was along the lines of Braunstein, that they were given characters to play in a medieval setting, like the King of Portugal. Some say the combat used a sort of rock, paper, scissors. Others say that that was more the way Braunstein had worked, because it was so divorced from wargaming that there weren't wargaming rules to cover what they were trying to do. Regardless of what exactly happened, Arneson's game was lightning in a bottle. It's just a question of how exactly he'd assembled it. But by now it should be obvious that this has been a tale of progression, each person adding a little bit more onto what the other had done and borrowing ideas from other wargamers. This was standard practice. These weren't publications. You couldn't go to the store and buy a Braunstein or a Braunstein. People were taking what they knew and modifying and adding to it. House variants, if you will. Some, though, would wind up in print, such as Gygax's chainmail that I mentioned last time. It should thus be no surprise that Gygax didn't just create chainmail out of whole cloth. Credit is shared with Jeff Perrin, who actually originated the rules in a small 4-page booklet that Gygax turned into a complete set of functional rules. Likewise, the fantasy supplement, Appendix E, was drawn from fantasy gaming. At the 1970 War Games Convention, Best of Show went to New England Wargamers, who had created a war game based upon The Lord of the Rings. The rules for the game were published in Courier, just a small 2-page spread that included wizards as part of the campaign, and who, besides having general fighting skill and the ability to improve morale, had one special ability, a strange form of ranged attack that was called a fireball. It could flat out kill many and would drive a dragon off. Given that Perrin himself was a known reader, his letter was in the next issue of the Courier, in fact, and there are many similarities in chainmail, including the spell fireball, now one word like the existing term for meteors and explosions. It's a virtual certainty that Gygax was inspired by this Lord of the Rings game, though he greatly expanded upon it for Appendix E, and again had the insight to see how it could integrate with an otherwise traditional fighting game. By this time, the wargaming hobby was represented in 2 ways: war board games and miniatures. While Gygax had been a massive fan of Gettysburg, Avalon Hill's biggest war board game success, nevertheless, he gravitated more towards miniatures, small metal recreations of some element of warfare, a soldier, a ship, or whatever, a specialization of the tin soldier that H.G. Wells' Little Wars had used. This led to what is a fine distinction that I will admit I will likely not employ correctly throughout the series, but I'll explain it now because it provides essential context. Avalon Hill's Gettysburg was a game. Gygax's Chainmail wasn't. Chainmail was a rules book. What you had was a company that would make the miniatures, and then they encouraged people to create rules for how to use them, preferably involving large armies so that they could sell lots of miniatures. These were typically made for free, with gamers thrilled just for the recognition, but Gygax wanted to make a little money off of his work. He was having financial problems after all. He'd gotten enough name recognition to be able to work with Don Lowry, who had a wargame store and was a member of the IFW. His new imprint, Guidon Games, would publish several board games and rules that Gygax had worked on in his spare time and was hoping to receive a modest commercial return from. This included Alexander the Great, Dunkirk, Tractics, and Chainmail. Arneson met Gygax at Gen Con, the Twin Cities being a mere 330 miles from Lake Geneva, where Arneson was selling some of his warship miniatures. Arneson had a particular passion for all things naval. Gygax, a fan of naval combat games himself, suggested the two work together on rules for a game to make use of such figures. The final result was a Napoleonic-era rules set called Don't Give Up the Ship, sold through Guidon Games, credited to Arneson, Gygax, and a fellow Twin Cities gamer named Mike Carr. Arneson, for all his creativity, was a poor typist and not skilled with grammar, and Carr had stepped in to turn Arneson's rules into something understandable. The amount of work he put in making these revisions were such that Gygax suggested making him a co-author and splitting the royalties 3 ways. He anticipated these would be small enough to not be worth quibbling over. However, Don't Give Up the Ship did rather well. Yet Guidon was not sending either Arneson or Carr their royalties, though Gygax received his because he was the editor of all rules, and without him, Lowry would see his line collapse. Besides working on those naval rules, Gygax and Arneson corresponded regularly as fellow wargamers and the frequent point men for their small clubs. Play-by-mail wargaming was quite common at this time. Arneson had seen the proto-version of Chainmail in a newsletter, but during their correspondence, Gygax mentioned Chainmail's coming release, including proudly mentioning Appendix E and its rules for fantasy settings, during the time that Arneson was working on his new game that would follow Braunstein. Arneson was intrigued. Chainmail already patched the concerns that he had over the combat, and the idea of the fantasy setting either, depending on the account, fit with what he was already thinking about, or inspired the direction that he would take. He'd already had the idea of integrating Avalon Hill's game Outdoor Survival into it, in order to handle some events, including, most obviously, things in the wilderness around where the action was happening. Chainmail solved the combat problem he had, and he was able to finally unveil his grand achievement, Blackmoor. Blackmoor fused together these different elements into a single unified whole. From Wesley and Jenkins, the idea of a game with individual goals and a sense of progression, but lousy combat. With Chainmail, a great combat system with tons of ideas for fantasy elements to be included, but no context, merely another war game. Once Arneson added Chainmail to Braunstein, now he finally had the entire game. Characters that the player controlled with goals, progression, in a fantastical setting with mythical creatures utilizing a robust and flexible combat system. In RPG evolutionary terms, Blackmoor was the first game that fully walked direct. The players loved it, but developing each adventure was involved, and one of them, Dave McGarry, noted this and came up with an idea of his own to help fill in the gaps and take some of the pressure off. A board game that he called Dungeons of Pashakati. McGarry was so pleased with the final result that he tried to sell the game, but none of the retailers were interested. Hopeful that Guidon Games might publish it, he spoke with Gygax, and in late 1972, he did a demonstration for Gygax at his home, with members of the local wargaming scene present. While Gygax was impressed and sure that this would be a great game for Guidon Games, he was incredibly impressed when Arneson then ran him through Blackmoor. There are disagreements on the specifics, but most likely present was Gygax's son Ernie, along with the brothers Rob and Terry Kuntz. Gygax had known Arneson had tweaked chainmail for his Blackmoor, having asked for any rules additions that might be useful for chainmail's revised printing, but he had no idea what it had become a part of, something like no war game he had ever played. Gygax asked Arneson for his notes, getting 18 handwritten pages from Arneson. Starting with them, Gygax spent 2 months creating a 50-page guide for this fantasy game, as they were calling it, and tested it out with 2 of his kids. His daughter was indifferent, but his son was blown away. And more work was invested in Gygax's version, Castle Greyhawk, while Arneson continued to run Blackmoor. They each ran their games differently, with Arneson providing maps and miniatures and such, while Gygax would give his players nothing. He wouldn't even allow them to be able to see him. He was shielded behind a filing cabinet. He also sent copies to wargamers that he knew, and they were amazed. The game was tested and refined over the next year, working out the kinks and finding out what techniques worked best. It's vital to note the degree to which both men were responsible for the birth of this game. Arneson had the understanding to piece together the elements to conceive of the overall concept. Gygax had the understanding of how to build it into a full system, and both of them worked to turn it into an exciting, entertaining experience. It's been asserted that Gygax was jealous of Arneson. We'll explore that further down the road. But whether he was or not, it is undeniable that Gygax had the mental skills and fortitude to do what others can't, which is to streamline, codify, and bring to completion. And that last point especially should not be downplayed. The world would be drowning in books if everyone who started writing finished it. Lives are littered with incomplete projects, or ones that are in our heads, we just need time to write it down, yet we never do. This quality goes unappreciated, but it is what separates our world from a world where role-playing games might never have existed. In a world filled with good ideas, the ones who deliver on those ideas are the kings. A point that is easily forgotten is that while Blackmoor may be the first true RPG, it still had the vestigial elements of a war game, and perhaps none are more surprising than the idea that for the same reason the referee did not control the opposing army in a Napoleonic engagement, Arneson didn't control the bad guy. That was another player, David Fant, who played the vampire baron of the castle, Sir Fang. Being the early 1970s, the vampire was perceived as being akin to Christopher Lee's portrayal in Hammer Horror. When Sir Fang kept getting stronger and stronger, bringing in more undead, the campaign's stability was called into question, and the idea of a counterbalance was needed, a Peter Cushing to battle Christopher Lee, a Van Helsing to his Dracula. The most obvious was the skill related to holding up a crucifix to repulse the vampire, but others were considered necessary as well to address some gaps in the game, like healing and curing disease. The priest was thus born, soon changed to cleric to make it seem more fitting, and suddenly Fang was now opposed by Bishop Carr. This is how the staple archetype of fantasy was created, to counterbalance a vampire, and is the reason why healing magic is associated with turning away the undead, such as in Elder Scrolls, where turn undead is in the restoration school of magic. After all the playtesting, they had what they felt was a solid rules set, and originally were looking at Guidon Games for publication. But Lowry was hurting, having never paid a penny to either Arneson or Mike Carr, and when he stopped paying Gygax, well, that's when he burned a bridge. Gygax had borrowed money from his mother against the royalties, and Guidon Games were paying her directly, so this was an embarrassment to Gygax. His public and private defense of Lowry evaporated in an instant, and he instead intended to publish his games himself. Gygax partnered up with his lifelong friend Don Kay to found Tactical Studies Rules. Kay borrowed against his life insurance policy to raise $1,000 of seed capital, but it wasn't going to be enough for the size of printing that the fantasy game would need, or as it was now being called, Dungeons and Dragons. Gygax had made a list of things that related to the game and combined them together, finding that the alliteration worked best. His wife and daughter both liked Dungeons and Dragons. With D&D being too expensive to produce, and the fact that Tactical Studies Rules saw itself as a war game publisher, they went for something that they felt was safer. Rules for the English Civil War called Cavaliers and Roundheads. Sales started strong with 200 sold quickly, but only 400 more sold over the next year. The intention had been for the early games to provide the money to support further publications, but the returns weren't enough for a D&D. However, a third partner was prepared to help out, Brian Bloom. He was only 24 years old, but worked for his father's company as a tool and die maker, and was able to contribute another $2,000, entering as an equal partner into the company. Even with that, though, it was published on a shoestring budget. Most of the artwork was farmed out to whoever was willing and paid peanuts, with a promise of royalties equal to that for every 1,000 copies that were sold. It's no surprise that the image on the front cover of the box of a Viking on a rearing horse to excite and inspire the potential buyers was in fact either traced or carefully copied from a panel on the final page of Strange Tales number 167, an issue that also provided an illustration for one of the interior pages of a mage. Dungeons & Dragons showed the many predecessors that had helped to lead to his finished product. Like H.G. Wells' Little Wars, if you bought the box for $10, you got a book to tell you how to play. Or in this case, 3 books. For $3.50 more, you could add in the innovation that Johann Ferdinand Oppiz brought to wargaming, dice. The game used a variety of polyhedral dice that weren't easy to get a hold of. Movement was drawn from Avalon Hill's use of hexes as opposed to squares. And the Kriegspiel innovation that was the heart of Dave Wesley's third branch of wargaming, taking the idea that someone could be there to interpret rules, know things the players didn't, and determine when someone had clearly won. Wesley's Braunstein had taken this all-powerful referee and turned them from a strict note-taker and umpire into the master architect of the scenario. They still knew things the players didn't and had to make judgment calls, but things like Arneson's absurd druid with a phaser was within the realm of possibility. They could be as hands-on or hands-off as they wished, railroading or doormat. In D&D, this referee became known eventually as the Dungeon Master, or DM for short. The 3 books that made up D&D were Men in Magic, Monsters and Treasures, and the Underworld and Wilderness Adventures. Men in Magic helped you to make your hero using 3 character classes, the Fighting Man, the Magic User, and the Cleric, with 4 races, humans, dwarves, elves, and halflings, and 3 alignments, law, chaos, and neutrality. Monsters and Treasures, self-explanatory title, gave out the beasties to fight and the spoils to be claimed. This booklet had the obvious, like undead creatures like zombies and skeletons, mythological creatures like the centaur or hydra, and humanoids like giants and hobgoblins. It also had slimes, the invisible stalker, and the purple worm. But of course, the true star were the 6 colors of dragons, coincidentally being the 5 colors from magic, white, blue, black, red, green, and gold, the color of multicolor spells. The Underworld and Wilderness Adventures talked about the adventuring, either in a dungeon or out in the wilds, but it suggested the use of Avalon Hill's outdoor survival to help with that if needed. They were hoping that D&D would do at least as well as Cavaliers and Roundheads, but it didn't. To perhaps understand how things shook out as they did, I'll refer to the popular Mike Judge show Silicon Valley, which spent years on the trials and tribulations of the main characters to build the ultimate media hosting app called Pied Piper. When they finally were able to do what they wanted, Pied Piper stagnated and then imploded. What they had made was designed by engineers, built by engineers, and tested by engineers, but never involved ordinary people, even though ordinary people were its target audience. The original Dungeons & Dragons suffered from similar problems. It evolved from wargaming, was made by wargaming experts, tested largely by wargamers. But wargaming was by no means a mainstream pastime. You see the problem. At least engineers were interested in Pied Piper, but wargamers generally regarded fantasy as being childish compared to their real pastime study of actual history. So the ones most capable of understanding it weren't interested, and the ones who would probably be most interested couldn't understand it. Critics lambasted the game. One even suggested that if they wanted to do something unique, they should have made a war game dedicated to the Balkan Wars. The way to learn to play D&D as it was originally written was to watch someone else play first and get the feel of it, rather than just picking it up and trying to read it from a book. As with Wizards of the Coast, Tactical Studies rules started out as a home-based business. With slow sales on D&D, they supplemented it with more traditional war games like Tricolor, and with a somewhat complicated problem with Heritage, who worked with them to make miniature figures, it resulted in Warriors of Mars, whose complexities we'll get into next time. Gygax, for his part, still believed in the potential of D&D despite poor sales and himself valuing it at $300 should they want to buy the rights back. People had trouble getting D&D, but those who got it really got it. It was thanks to one of these playgroups that another iconic piece of the puzzle was added. In Santa Monica, California, Gary Schweitzer, a hobby shop owner, led a campaign on the world of Aurania, Aurania, on account of the large amount of gold there. One of the characters had a dwarf for a sidekick who wanted to pick a lock with his dagger. They used the magic user as a template, but created skills rather than spells for the character to use, and gave them more of a non-combat role. Originally thought of as a burglar, they decided to call their creation the Thief. Schweitzer informed Gygax of the idea, who refined it further with percentage for success and failure, and added the backstab attack to give the character more usefulness in combat. Much like the cleric, the thief class, also called the rogue to give it a less criminal sound, is such a staple it's hard to imagine that there was ever a time when that archetype wouldn't be part of fantasy. The first new full-time employee came about thanks to perhaps the strangest job application in history. Tim Kask was a Vietnam vet, spending 10 months on the USS Ranger, where he was responsible for dealing with the advanced tech in downed planes to keep it out of enemy hands, sometimes having to head into a region where he couldn't even recognize the alphabet, never mind the language, of the country that he was in, so that he could then toss thermite grenades into downed American planes. With that kind of background, it's no surprise to see his determination in getting an answer to a wargaming question that was bothering him. Kask had been a long-time gamer, even spending entire weekends with no sleep playing 1914 while in the Navy. So when something came up with chainmail and he had no idea what to do, he reasoned that there was unlikely to be that many Gygaxes in a place as small as Lake Geneva, and managed one evening to get directory assistance to put him through to Gary Gygax. Rather than being annoyed that a stranger called him after 9 p.m. to ask about his game, Gygax took an immediate liking to the man. The two had regular conversations after that, and Gygax invited Kask to come up to the Gen Con when Dungeons & Dragons was released, and said that when he finished college the following year, he could take a job working for him if he liked. Well, Kask did so, working as editor as well as helping to hand-assemble the copies of D&D that they had. But that's when tragedy struck. Don K. was only 36 years old when he dropped dead of a heart attack. Gygax was devastated, first by the loss of his dear friend, but then with the consequences of his passing. Kay had the skills and temperament to handle the business of tactical studies rules, leaving Gygax free to handle the creative side. With Kay gone, not only were they missing that vital element, but Kay's widow didn't have that passion for what they were doing that her husband had. Yet she was an equal partner in it. While Gygax's lack of respect for Lowry and his Guidon games only grew since the unpaid royalties, he nevertheless conceded that the man's plan had been sound. It was just that Lowry was a lousy businessman in his estimation. So the idea of having a brick-and-mortar hobby shop alongside their game publishing company was something that he was thoroughly on board with, even if Tactical Studies Rules couldn't afford it. Not to worry, Bloom always liked the idea of having a store like that, so he used his savings to begin work on it, incorporated as TSR Hobbies, with the intention that Tactical Studies Rules would buy it out when it had the money to do so. Instead, with Don Kay gone, they did the opposite. TSR bought out the partnership that was Tactical Studies Rules. Simple enough for the pair of them, since they would simply take ownership of TSR. But for Kay's widow, they would have to buy her out, and Gygax didn't have the money to do that. So Brian Bloom's father did so. He was now semi-retired and spent most of his time golfing. He was effectively a silent partner. Gygax would step up and handle the business side of things in addition to the creative side. He was simply the only one there who could do it. Gygax then created the first and most important supplement to Dungeons & Dragons, Greyhawk. You'd be forgiven for thinking that this was a detailed description of Castle Greyhawk, the campaign world that Gygax had used in playtesting and refining D&D. But Gygax was resistant to putting all that hard work out there for others to use. Instead, it was effectively an update to the rules, all put into one book, including refining the combat, so you no longer needed to refer to chainmail, adding in the thief class, along with paladin as a subclass of fighting man, increased the level of spells from 6 to 9, and added more monsters and treasure. The book is structured the way that the original D&D was, with sections for each of the 3 books within, giving it more a feel of an update to the original than as a supplement. Supplement 2 was similar, Arneson's Blackmoor. 2 new subclasses appeared, and both surprising, although for different reasons. One subclass was that of the cleric, the monk, odd for its inclusion of an Eastern figure in an otherwise Western fantasy setting. Apparently, due to a miscommunication, works exist that present Friar Tuck-like monks posed in various martial arts stances. Many stories have sprung up about it, most amusingly David M. Yoltz in his work of Dice and Men, which seems to include a lot of whispered game lore that contradicted facts. He says that the monk was created thanks to the contemporary disco hit Kung Fu fighting. But much more likely than that is that Brian Bloom's love of the David Carradine show Kung Fu was involved. Although Tim Kask would later say he wasn't sure if it was Bloom or Arneson who conceived of it. Some have asserted that Gygax later credited himself as the creator, but reading those statements in context, it seems pretty obvious that Gygax was referring to how he saw the integration of it into the larger context of D&D, rather than claiming to originate the class personally. A notable distinction because of exaggerations that Gygax would eventually make down the line. After all, I've come neither to praise nor bury Gygax, but just to give an honest interpretation of the events as I can. The other class of Blackmoor was a thief subclass called the Assassin. This inclusion bothered some people, as an assassin at the time was not perceived as being heroic at all. We are talking the decade that followed the public murder of John F. Kennedy, after all. Unlike the monk, people are hardly tripping over themselves to get credit for that one, but a few things that we should keep in mind are that D&D was still in its early days. Who knew where the game was going to be going from there? The original Blackmoor had required the evil Sir Fang, remember, so evil player characters were there since D&D was still in its primordial soup. The other thing to remember is that at the time, experience was gained via treasure, not defeating monsters. The entire point of that was that it didn't matter how you got the treasure, it only mattered that you got it. So, for an assassin, someone who clearly was willing to reach the finish line by a less straightforward means, this kind of made sense. In addition to the subclasses, Blackmoor included rules for underwater combat and targeting body parts in combat. But unlike Greyhawk, Arneson chose to include one of the many adventures that had occurred during his Blackmoor campaign, Temple of the Frog. For the first time, the players were handed an adventure that they could play. This was important because the biggest enemy of D&D was its own complexity, which planted the seed for its own potential downfall. See, Ken St. Andre in Phoenix, Arizona, had read through his friend's D&D and loved it, except for the fact it was so damn complicated. As I said, it was made by seasoned wargamers who, despite the innovations, were still accustomed to thinking in wargame terms and accustomed to that high level of complexity. The reason for the need for a referee was that grognards, as they like to call themselves, loved arguing over what the rules even meant. Ken St. Andre decided that he could make his own streamlined version of D&D, and he called it Tunnels and Trolls. He was just selling it personally at conventions, but when it was seen by Flying Buffalo, a play-by-mail game company, they quickly brought it to market, the second RPG to hit. While the name might suggest that it's a cheap imitation akin to movies like Transmorphers and Almighty Thor, Tunnels and Trolls was positively received, with easier to understand rules and the use of common six-sided dice to play. It also created new concepts for the game, like armor reducing damage rather than affecting the chance of being hit, and the idea of attribute-based saving throws, rolling dice to avoid a bad thing happening, boosted by the relevant attribute. But the biggest change was in the use of magic. While Dave Arneson had originated what became D&D, there's no denying that Gary Gygax's fingerprints are all over it. Having the chance to explore the fantastical like this allowed him a chance to use things that had always interested him. The Paladin subclass, for instance, was inspired by the protagonist of a 1962 fantasy novel called 3 Hearts and 3 Lions, which also originated the idea of lawful, chaotic, or neutral. Likewise, Gygax's interest in the work of Jack Vance, notably Dying Earth, is the reason that it uses the magic system it does. In fact, it's the reason it's called Vancian magic. In Vancian magic, the idea is a magic user is kind of like a baker. They can make rolls, cupcakes, donuts, a variety of things, provided that they know the recipe, and then take the time and possibly acquire the ingredients in order to be able to make it. After it's done, they now have that for when they need it. If a moment arises when a chocolate cupcake is required, they can pull out a chocolate cupcake, but they have already had to make it. And what's more, if the situation calls for a vanilla cupcake or a pumpkin spice cupcake, well, they can't change it. And of course, there's only so many that you can make and carry around with you at a time. Vancian magic thus operated like the devices that Q makes for James Bond, put in place so the hero can call upon them when the moment arises during the narrative. Hence why it's derisively called utility belt magic. But Tunnels and Trolls made use of a point-based magic system. In this case, the magic power, typically mana, is determined by the spells you know and the power that you have left. Think of mana as being like gasoline. You can put it in a car to have rapid transportation, or into a generator to make electricity, or into a glass bottle with a lit rag to have a fire attack, or into a chainsaw to cut things quickly, and so on. Mana is used for whatever you need it, but your power is capped by how much you have left, and you need to find a way to recover it once it's gone. Well, Tunnels and Trolls got to the point where TSR sent lawyers after them, saying they couldn't even mention Dungeons & Dragons when describing their game. This was likely a bluff, as it wasn't until 1977 that the name Dungeons & Dragons was actually trademarked. In fact, some argued they should just call it Dungeons and Dragons and then trademark the term, but whether or not they could get away with that isn't really the issue. The issue is that it was filling a niche that Dungeons and Dragons itself wasn't. The learning curve was keeping potential customers away. D&D was a greater simulation, but it would do little good if people weren't interested in investing the kind of time needed to appreciate it. They'd need to make some changes if they didn't want to be competed out of the very market that they had invented. It was someone operating in the same vein as Ken St. Andre that helped to address this, a medical doctor and associate professor of neurology, and who also sometimes wrote books with naked women gripped by tentacles. His name is Eric Holmes, or sometimes John Eric Holmes, and he loved D&D and also found it hard to teach others. Being a writer, he wrote up an easier way to understand how all of this worked, streamlining and simplifying while also adding in sample dungeons to make it work, all to help him teach his kids how to play. He adapted his work for publication by TSR, who released it as the basic set, to help players learn how to play and cover the first 3 levels. Once players understood that, they were ready to move on to the next product, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which existed in 3 hardcover rulebooks: the Monster Manual, the Player's Handbook, and the Dungeon Master's Guide. The reason for the label of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons wasn't just to differentiate it from the basic set. It was a very public step for Gygax to push Arneson out of the spotlight, so that Gygax would stand alone as the creator of the game. Together they had created something magical, but now, like the sad fate of many relationships, the magic was gone.